The billion-dollar lie, Howard Hughes and the cover story. If you're going to build a ship the size of a stadium with a hole in its belly and a derrick like an oil rig, you can't hide it. So you make the story bigger than the truth. The CIA needed a face the world would accept without asking for details. Howard Hughes, reclusive, eccentric, already orbiting classified contracts, fit like a glove. He didn't need to show up. His name did the work. The pitch was simple and audacious. Manganese nodules. Ocean floors carpeted in potato-sized mineral lumps, rich in nickel, copper, cobalt. Treasure you could scoop if only you built a ship with a moon pool and a vertical pipe string. Hughes companies would mine them with a cutting-edge vessel, the Hughes Glomar Explorer. Trade journals ran pieces. Congressional staffers nodded. Competitors peered over the fence and wondered if they were late to a revolution. Meanwhile, Global Marine and Lockheed quietly engineered what the nodules could never justify. A capture system named Clementine and a heave compensator that could soothe a string 3 miles long. Front companies sprouted like mushrooms after rain. Summer Corporation took point. A paper mining outfit, Macrodyne, carried contracts. Shell entities signed leases. Bankers saw balance sheets that looked plausible enough for an oil boom era drunk on offshore tech. The beauty of the lie was that parts were true. Deep sea mining research existed. Oceanographers had mapped nodule fields. The engineering for mining overlapped just enough with the real mission that welders believed their instructions and port officials stamped paperwork without fuss. In Chester, Pennsylvania, Sun Shipbuilding laid steel for a hull with proportions that made foremen sweat. The central well, moon pool to the folks on deck, was sold as a way to bring mining pipe aboard without waves tearing it to shreds. The derrick and traveling block looked like a driller's dream. Inside conference rooms, security officers rehearsed answers. It's proprietary. It's a competitive edge. It's Hughes. You don't argue with a billionaire who likes to be left alone. The cover story didn't just mask. It pulled other players into orbit. Marine insurers wrote policies on a business they didn't fully understand. Journalists toured parts of the ship with guides who pointed at future collector modules and handed out brochures with glossy art. The public saw a frontier. Engineers saw load charts. Case officers saw time bought. There was one problem. Secrets leaked sideways. In 1974, thieves broke into a Hughes office in Los Angeles and stole documents tying the mining project to the agency. That wouldn't have sunk a normal cover, but this ship was too strange to ignore. The FBI and LAPD chased the burglars, and the chase made noise. Reporters started sniffing. The Los Angeles Times ran a story, vague and flawed, but close enough to irritate. The word Glomar hit print. The CIA didn't sue for silence. It dialed lawyers and tightened circles. They asked editors to hold specifics. Some did, others didn't. Then, in March 1975, Jack Anderson went on national radio and said the quiet part out loud. Howard Hughes' ship wasn't mining. It had gone out to fish for a Soviet sub. He promised more. Inside the West Wing, staffers stared at phones. The president wouldn't confirm. The agency couldn't explain. The cover had done its job long enough to lift. Now it had to absorb heat. But go back a step. Before Anderson, before the burglars, the cover story worked so well it created a market. Academic conferences added panels on polymetallic nodules. Corporations drafted feasibility studies. And irony took root. The lie didn't just hide action. It drove real investment toward the fiction. Hughes' name gave permission. The ship's size made it a fact. Even the Soviets, watching with a jaundiced eye, sent the trawler Gidrograph to loiter near nodule surveys, unsure whether to laugh or worry. Inside the Glomar Explorer, life matched the blur. Crews wore company badges, not government pins. Security was a culture, not a checkpoint. You didn't ask about the moon pool's dimensions, you measured them. Hallway posters showed nodules, engineering binders showed Clementine bays. When the ship sailed, the manifest said mining. The hold carried tools for something else. That's how good covers work. They let most people tell the truth and still lie. The money trail told a similar story. Estimates hovered in the hundreds of millions, ballooning past $1 billion in today's terms. Congress wasn't voting line items labeled "Raise Soviet submarine." The funds flowed through contracts that looked like technology bets and deep ocean research. Cost overruns were explained the way cost overruns are always explained. Design complexity, schedule compression, supplier delays. The difference was that failure meant more than a bad quarter. If the cover cracked before the lift, Moscow might park a destroyer on the box and call it oceanography. There's a micro moment buried in a memo, a public affairs draft line explaining that Hughes, innovative mining vessel, would test novel seabed systems at extreme depths. It's the word novel that gives the game away. They were testing, just not for manganese. The phrase would survive in press kits even after the ship docked with a story it couldn't tell. When Anderson spoke, the White House chose a new tactic, neither confirm nor deny. The Glomar response wasn't born to be cute, it was born to keep a lid on fallout while the Soviets guessed. But that's later. In this chapter, the cover story does what it was built to do. It hides ambition in plain sight, wraps a claw in a mining tale, and buys 8 days of lift in the middle of nowhere. The lie cost a fortune. It bought time. Building the Glomar Explorer, a factory for secrets. They didn't build a ship. They built a machine that pretended to be a ship. At Sun's shipbuilding in Chester, Pennsylvania, yard whistles blew and weld arcs stitched daylight into plates big enough to make foreman joke that Hughes had ordered a floating warehouse. The drawings said mining. The centerline said something else. A moon pool, a rectangular void running through the hull, wide enough to swallow a house and deep enough to hide intent. Above it rose a derrick with a traveling block and elevators that looked like offshore drilling hardware, except everything was thicker, straighter, cleaner. You could mine nodules with this. You could also, maybe, reach down and take hold of a wreck. Everything about the Explorer pushed proportions. The central, well-demanded transverse strength that fought the hole it carved. Frames wrapped around absence, bulkheads stepped to keep the well from becoming a fault line. The hull had to be stiff enough to resist hogging and sagging, yet forgiving enough to ride swells without turning load spikes into cracks. Inside, corridors threaded past machinery spaces sized like small buildings. Hydraulic rooms for heave compensation, electrical switchgear for a city block, and pipe racks that looked like sculpture until you realized each elbow had a reason. Security lived in the mundane. Welders got badges that opened only what they needed. Drawings were broken into work packages that didn't add up unless you'd seen all of them. A man fitting a bearing carrier knew its tolerances, not its destiny. A woman designing a hydraulic manifold saw flow charts, not the claw it would feed. The cover allowed the truth to hide in parts. You could answer questions honestly and still be inside a lie. The bay that would cradle Clementine didn't look like a lair. It looked like a staging area with anchors for mining tools, tie-down points for collector modules, and an overhead crane capacity that made visiting engineers whistle. Every pad eye was overbuilt. Every deck plate was thicker than it had to be, unless you assumed vertical loads in the hundreds of tons. The ship's heart, the gimbaled heave compensator, arrived in pieces and was assembled like a ritual. Its pistons rose taller than a man. Its accumulators looked like torpedoes cut for parts. If it worked, the pipe string would float on a cushion even while the bow climbed a swell. If it hiccuped under full load, the string would sign wave and snap. Supply chains split and doubled. Global Marines procurement bought drill pipe by the mile, specified to thread tolerances weirdly tight for longevity. Lockheed's shop in Redwood City turned out captive parts under generic names. A single bolt pattern changed across 3 generations in a month because someone flagged a thread pitch that galled in cold tests. The memo said, "Field experience recommends revision." Field experience was a pressure vessel in a warehouse and a clock. Timelines didn't just compress, they crushed. Schedules ran parallel, inspections ran hot. X-ray trucks crawled weld seams, then crawled them again. A young inspector caught a hairline in a load path and didn't go home for 2 days because the fix threatened the sequence. A foreman signed off on a component he didn't understand and wrote, "See me," on the Traveler because he wanted to see who came. A machinist stared at a bearing race that shouldn't exist in a miner and signed anyway, because the spec sheet wore the right logos. Above deck, the derrick rose. It looked like all-field kit, until you stared at the traveling block's stroke and the traveling spider's cheeks. The block's oversized sheaves were there to keep wire rope bend radius gentle under crime scene loads. The spider's jaws weren't for pipe with drilling mud inside. They were for a clean string you barbied like glass. The moon pool got its doors, massive steel leaves that could shut the sea out so crews could work over still water. Their seals were over-designed for a frontier nobody in the yard admitted they were crossing. Then came the living spaces, long halls, bunks tight as clipboards, a mess that could feed an all-field crew and a few ghosts. Security added layers disguised as admin. Visitors saw lounges and conference rooms. Select crews saw a catwalk walkway under the well, a place where you could look down into a rectangle of night that would one day glow green with work lights and mist. Pressure testing became a religion. Dock trials grew into sea trials that looked routine to reporters on the pier. Departure, return, boilerplate interviews about systems integration. Out at a quiet anchorage, they cycled the compensator until valve bodies warmed, ran the traveling block up and down until a lubrication schedule wrote itself in oil on the deck, and lowered dummy strings through the moon pool until ship motion turned numbers into trust. A deck plate groaned once, just once, when a load kissed a limit, and the chief engineer called a meeting in a space you'll never see on a tour. He said, "If it groans, stop." It became scripture. There's a micro story from Chester. A foreman opened a crate marked collector shoe, Rev C, and found pads with a finish he'd only seen on aerospace jobs. He ran his hand over the surface, frowned, and taped the crate shut. He signed the form because the schedule was real. He went home and told no one what it felt like to touch a secret. By the time the Explorer slid down the ways in 1973, she wore two skins. One reflected back cameras and questions with a story that worked. The other hummed under steel, pumps, pipe, cylinders, waiting for a lift no one could name in public. The yard crew cheered. The ocean waited. The factory for secrets went to sea. Chasing shadows, Soviet eyes, and American paranoia. While the Glomar Explorer took shape, the other side wasn't sleeping. The Soviet Navy never found K-129, but they did the next best thing. They watched anyone who might. Intelligence trawlers with innocent names and dirty antennas started loitering near legitimate oceanographic surveys. One ship, the Gidrograph, showed up so often it felt like a neighbor who never waved. On paper, it collected hydrological data. In practice, it took pictures, logged bearings, and radioed anything that smelled like cover. In Moscow, the debate sharpened. Admirals who'd scoffed at American engineering now hedged. If the US was building a ship that large to mine, it might be theater. It might not. Cables to Pacific Fleet warned, assume deception, assign assets. A surveillance plan materialized, shadow any Hughes-linked vessel, seed rumors, push propaganda about imperialist pillage of seabed resources. Even if the Americans failed, making them look foolish was free. Meanwhile, inside the CIA, paranoia grew a spine. Counterintelligence briefings stapled to operations plans. Port calls that looked routine turned into choreography. Crews swapped at odd hours. Supplies labeled to fit the mining fiction. Shore leave shaved down because loose talk doesn't stay loose. Security officers scrubbed manifests until Clementine vanished into a sea of collector modules and test assemblies. In a vault, someone wrote in neat block letters, "Treat all approaches as hostile." Timing became a weapon. The first window to sail was set against both weather and press cycles. Reporters poked after the Lowe's Angels office burglary, but hadn't yet pieced the story together. If the Explorer could reach station, drop the string, and start the lift before news hardened, the ocean might drown the hints in distance. If not, you'd have cameras on the pier asking about nodules while you prayed the sea would play along. Unknown to them across an ocean, a Soviet desk officer underlined a date on a calendar. He'd seen shipping notices for peculiar cargoes and a naval attaché's snippet on Sun Shipbuilding's rush. He wrote mining with a question mark big enough to be hope. In his next memo, he added Maskirovka probable, because deception is easier to believe than audacity. He wasn't wrong. He just wasn't right enough. At sea, paranoia turned into practice. Acoustic transponders were deployed with motions that minimized the chance of a surface wake and a satellite could read. Helicopters launched only when absolutely required. Even then, their flight paths were bent to look like all-field ops. A micro-story. A deckhand, told to stencil mining on a crate, painted the letters twice, then wiped his hands like he'd touched something live. He didn't know why the word felt heavy. He just knew not to ask. American counterintelligence didn't just look outward. It looked home. Background checks tightened. Phone calls that would have slid under the radar in another program got logged. Reporters received calls couched as favors. The story's wrong. Printing it hurts sources you'd rather not burn. Some held, others didn't. The agency learned, again, that the First Amendment doesn't wear a badge. The Soviets probed in their way. A fishing vessel edged within binocular range of an innocuous survey ship testing seabed hardness. A deck camera on the American ship caught a man on the trawler's wing bridge lifting his own camera like a toast. The image made a briefing slide, and a senior officer tapped it with his pen. "If they're here for nodules," he said, "we're late." No one laughed. Inside the Explorer's radio room, operators listened harder than they spoke. The mining fiction came with public-facing traffic, calls to ports, parts orders, weather requests. Under that layer lived a tight net, bursts when necessary, silence otherwise. The guidance was simple: don't give anyone a pattern to measure. Patterns get you caught. Then Jack Anderson spoke on the air. The word Glomar left his mouth and slid across kitchen tables. In Langley, lawyers leaned into phones and invented a sentence that would live longer than any of them. We can neither confirm nor deny. On deck, nothing changed. Steel still weighed the same. The ocean didn't care about radio shows. But the Soviet calculus did. By late June 1974, they'd assigned a ship to sit on the site. The trawler wasn't a destroyer. It was a reminder: we see you seeing us. From the Explorer's bridge, the captain watched a dot hang on the horizon and plotted a course that kept the dot at the same bearing. Distance is a kind of courtesy. Paranoia isn't just fear, it's attention. American counterintelligence planted decoys, box loads labeled for nodule assay, going to warehouses with real addresses, schedules filed with the Coast Guard that listed waypoints a day old. Soviet surveillance logged it all and fed it into computers that sorted ships by nonsense. In the noise, the truth moved. There's a human moment that doesn't fit on a chart. A Russian radio operator, scanning frequencies on a night watch, paused on a clean, professional silence where chatter should have been. He logged the absence. 10 days later, he told his girlfriend he was listening for ghosts. She said sometimes ghosts are just people doing their jobs too well. The Explorer would go anyway. The Soviets would circle. The Americans would whisper. What tied them together wasn't ideology. It was the same ocean, indifferent and patient, waiting to see who blinked first. The grab, steel on steel, at 16,500 feet. They lowered Clementine slow enough to make minutes feel like hours. The moon pool boiled green under deck lights, then calmed as the compensator found its rhythm. Below that rectangle, the string went taut and vanished into black. Depth calls came in like a metronome, 1,000, 5, 10, each number a reminder that errors compound when you stack them 3 miles deep. On the bridge, a clock ticked. In the bay, a bosun whispered to no one, "Easy." At 16,000 feet, the world got small. The capture vehicle's lights pushed a white tunnel through particulate, flakes drifting like slow snow. Then shadows coalesced into geometry, frames, plating, a curve that once housed a missile. The wreck didn't look asleep. It looked held down by the sea. The pilot, hands on joysticks, eyes on a bank of monitors, breathed through his mouth and inched forward. He'd practiced this on mock-ups above pressure tanks, but the mock-ups never smelled like brine. Sensors read out ranges and angles that didn't agree. Internal waves rocked the beam just enough to make straight lines lie. The guidance tech called a correction. The pilot ignored it, then took half of it. "Settle," the chief said, not because the machine could hear, but because the men could. He bled a breath and bumped Clementine down until pads kissed mud and held. The wreck loomed. The first finger slid under steel. Every pad had its own mind. Hydraulics pressurized slow, then held while strain gauges woke and plotted load across the spread. If numbers jumped, they stopped. If numbers crept, they eased another inch. Touchpoints mattered. A pad too high on a corroded plate would punch through like a knuckle through tissue. Too low, and it would pry the hull off frames it still trusted. They hunted for ribs by feel and by ghost. A jiggle in a gauge meant structure. A dead calm meant void. There's a micro moment you won't find in a tech manual. A tiny crab, ghost white and foolish at that depth, scuttled across a strut and froze in light that had no business there. The pilot twitched and laughed once, short. Then he eased a finger another inch, and the crab vanished into mud that behaved like memory. When the last finger found purchase, the math took over. Squeeze to seat, pause, read spread, bleed pressure into the pads that were lying to themselves about evenness. Somewhere above, the heave compensator hissed and the ship rose and fell without transposing that motion to the claw. The chief called for line. 1 inch. Hold. 2. Hold. The wreck complained. Not loud, not catastrophe, just a long, low groan that came up the pipe like a throat clearing. On the bridge, the captain put both hands on the console and didn't move them. The first inch off the bottom felt like a mile. Silt puffed into a brown storm, and the monitors turned useless. They were blind, but for numbers. Load rose to a plateau, sat there, then settled a hair as suction let go. They took another inch. The string bent a degree, then the compensator soothed it straight. Men who'd never believed in luck studied gauges the way believers study prayer books and asked the sea to keep telling the truth. Minutes became choreography. Voice loops trimmed to essential. A heave valve that had pecked during tests hummed like a choir. Temperatures crept. A rookie looked sideways at a veteran and saw him blink slow, then open his eyes wide and reset the world. On a monitor, mud cleared enough to show the gap where the wreck had lived and the new line it was drawing through water that had no room for arrogance. They lifted feet, then tens of feet. Loads climbed with a staircase pattern, stick and slip encoded in steel. Every plateau was a conversation between rust and pressure. Somewhere inside the hull, something shifted, a locker door, a frame surrendering, and the pads redistributed the way good hands do when a friend stumbles. The math allowed it. Barely. Above, the Soviet trawler held station on the horizon. On its bridge, a petty officer scanned a calm sea and wrote, nothing significant, in a log he did not love. Down the hall, a signals man tuned across frequencies that weren't talking and heard a kind of dignity in silence. He would go off watch and smoke on a stern deck where the air smelled like fish, not secrets. The Explorer's crew climbed through midnight and into a morning no one saw. The string grew a foot shorter with each call. When they crossed 1,000 feet up, a kid in the bay let himself grin and got kicked gently by a chief with 2 fingers, eyes back. The old man wasn't being mean. He'd lived close enough to failure to be careful about joy. There's a line you don't meet until you cross it. Up to that point, risk feels like a set of numbers. After it, risk becomes a neighbor. The men in that bay met him and nodded and kept working. Steel on steel in a place built for silence. A claw closing around a secret the ocean had kept. And the mantra, whispered or thought, if it groans, stop. If it doesn't, lift. The snap, when the ocean took half back. Halfway home, something changed. It didn't arrive with fireworks. It arrived as a tremor, tiny then not, running up through steel like a thought you don't want. Loads crept, then jumped. A pad strain gauge hiccuped. In the control bay, the chief lifted his head before the numbers caught up and said one word into the loop. Hold. The ship obeyed. Heave compensation hissed into a flatter rhythm. Temperatures steadied a hair. The pilot eased Clementine's grip a fraction to relax a pad that was lying. For a moment, the wreck seemed to settle into itself, a tired body shifting on a stretcher. Then the staircase pattern turned into a sawtooth. One finger squealed, a sound more felt than heard. Somewhere inside the hull section, a frame let go with a dull, unfriendly thud. There's a physics to forgiveness, and they'd budgeted for it. Pads could redistribute, hydraulics could balance, but corrosion doesn't honor budgets. A corroded plate at one pad's contact finally behaved like what it was, lace. Under peak stress it tore, not a clean failure, a zipper. The rip ran until it found a rib and force rerouted itself across the claw like panic. The compensator did its best. The string flexed. The ship rode the motion. The chief had already said the next word. Down. He got 1 inch. It wasn't enough. The break didn't look like a break. Monitors flared with silt. Gauges went non-linear. Numbers that had felt like friends turned abstract. The sound, when it arrived, came up the pipe like a distant argument that ended badly. A short oscillation, 1-2, and then load fell in a way no one wanted. Most of what Clementine held tore free and dropped. Not clean, not total. A piece in the jaws remained, a forward section torn back like a page ripped mid-paragraph. The rest, heavier and more honest to gravity, slid. Visuals showed nothing but brown. Instruments said mass moving past. On deck, no one spoke. In the trawler's bridge, a Russian signals man looked up from a crossword and frowned at nothing in particular. The ocean doesn't perform for witnesses. Down in the control space, the chief's voice stayed level. Stabilize what we've got. The pilot did his job, easing pressure into the fingers that still had metal beneath them, starving the ones that were grabbing air. Heave compensation bled and fed as the string shivered with the recall of a loss that wasn't negotiable. A rookie opened his mouth and closed it. The veteran next to him rolled his shoulders once, as if a burden had shifted from a place muscles could help to a place they couldn't. The next hour wasn't drama. It was work, incremental and mean. They tuned pads until loads looked survivable. They checked seals that had no reason to care. The chief asked for a depth confirmation. The reply came back in a voice that sounded older than the man using it. Above, the captain didn't move his hands from the console. He didn't need to. The ship knew where it had to be.